text from Psalm 22 is most often used by Christians as a fulfillment of Christ's crucifixion. The Gospel writers used excerpts from this psalm, not to mention many other scripture texts, as proof texts for their understanding of Jesus. In today's world, we call that plagiarism. First, Mark wrote his gospel. Actually, no, Paul wrote most of his letters first. But then Mark wrote his gospel of the four gospels first. And he used maybe a little bit of Q or Koheleth, the source. Then Matthew and Luke came along. They used a whole lot of Mark and a little bit of the source. And then John came along, and I have to admit, that's in a class all its own, and it's very different from the other three. So for our purposes today, in referring to the ancient world, I'm not going to call it plagiarism. I'm going to call it appropriation. They used previously written and known texts and appropriated them to prove what they were trying to say was true. For the fulfillment of ancient scripture. Just pointing to two at the very beginning of Psalm 22, which we didn't sing. Verse 1 of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Who ever heard that? Didn't Jesus say that from the cross? That's what the gospel writers tell us. Verse 18 of Psalm 22. They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Sound familiar? The gospel writers used that as well. Almost these exact words are used by the writers of the gospel in the crucifixion scenes. Now, I do not believe that the writers from either Genesis or Psalms wrote their texts in forecasts or predictions of Jesus. There are many Christians who believe that. I'm not one of them. Our Bible is a collection of books, a collection of stories of God's people that were gathered over many, many years. It tells how they experienced God and how they experienced life. And I don't believe it was ever intended to be read literally. That's perhaps what separates me from many other Christians in our world today. It does, however, point to truth as a metaphor. Oh, there's another whole sermon right there. Today I'm not interested in proof texting or appropriation of texts. What I know is that both Genesis text and our psalm would have been familiar for the audiences that are most often read in. The community of the Hebrew people knew these texts. They had power for these ancient communities. And even they had power for the earliest Christians, for them to have been used as texts within the newer Christian context. And those earliest Christians were, by the way, Jewish, and they would have known these texts. I think I'll use this text here and this text here because it explains what we experience with Jesus. But I'd like to look at the texts in the power of their own right. I still believe they contain power for us. So, in our text from Genesis, we're overhearing God's conversation with Abram, who is now to become Abraham. And it seems that from this text, the name Abraham master of a multitude. God is making a covenant with Abraham and Sarai, who now becomes Sarah, and also with their future generations. What is the covenant? What is God's promise? To be God. There aren't any conditions. He doesn't say, Abraham, you have to do this. He promises to be God. To be forever God. For them, for all the many offspring, for the multitude of nations who will come from them. So, I want to take a moment to draw just a little family tree. So, we have Adam and Eve. Okay? They have their families. We have Noah. And they have their families. We have Abraham and Sarah. And that's where we are. Now, Abraham and Sarah were about 100 years old. And God is promising them that they're going to have generations. Sarah laughed. Do you blame her? But Sarah, thinking she wasn't going to conceive after all this time, gives her slave woman, Hagar, to Abraham. And they have a son, Ishmael. Okay? Meanwhile, the angels come back and say Sarah's going to have a child, and she still laughs, but they do have a son. Who is it? Isaac. So, Sarah becomes jealous of Hagar because she doesn't want Ishmael to inherit the blessings of God. She wants her son, Isaac, to carry that blessing. So off Ishmael and Hagar are sent into the desert to die. But God still makes a promise. God promises Abraham and Sarah that a great nation will come from Isaac. God promises Hagar that from Ishmael will come a great nation. Islam, Muhammad, comes from the house of Ishmael. Israel comes from the house of Isaac. And from this comes Jesus. Two great nations, fulfilling God's promise. From you will come great nations. And it wasn't until I was in Israel and meeting with both Jewish and Muslim men and women that there was a 100-year-old Muslim man who said to me, or to us, we have one God. We have many ladders. Many what? Ladders. One God, many ladders. Because we all go back to Abraham and Sarah. Okay? That's just... Now, is that literal? I don't know. It kind of helps explain it, but... So, No matter how much the Jewish community and the Muslim community hate each other, no matter how much they fight with each other, no matter how much Christians get involved in the battle, we are all still blessed by God. We all still belong to God. And God's promise to always remain God for all of us stands even today. Many generations later, Mary and Joseph and Jesus, children of Abraham too, and for us, many, many more generations later, we belong to God. God is our God, and we are God's forever. Not that we are God's, we belong to God. In our psalm, we skipped that first portion of this particular psalm. Verses 1 through 22, we hear the psalmist lamenting directly to God that God has abandoned the writer. In it, we find perhaps some of the deepest forms of lament and complaint to God, and then it suddenly shifts to praise. Why? Because I suspect that even the psalmist who feels abandoned by God, he or she knows that God has heard the cry and lament, and God will answer the cry. The psalmist believes this and is willing to even place his or her life on the line by saying, I shall live for him. I shall live for God. The psalmist knows the covenant blessing of God. The psalmist uses the words praise, glorify, stand in awe, vows I will pay, remember, turn, worship, bow down, live for, serve, proclaim. To whom does the psalmist speak? To the offspring of Jacob, the offspring of Israel, the poor, those who seek, all of the families, all of the nations, those who died, even those who haven't been born yet, future generations, you and me. So what's this whole thing about? It's all about God's promise. That age-old covenant that God made with Abraham and Sarah and with all future generations. The covenant that says we are always belonging to God. We are forever God's. And God will always be our God. God will be forever God. And I think at this juncture, with all that is happening in our world today, we need this reminder. We need to remember. So I'd like to invite you to repeat after me. No matter how much I mess up.
No matter how much I mess up.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
No matter how much joy-filled or grief-filled I am.
No matter how joy-filled or grief-filled I am.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
No matter how good or sinful I am.
No matter how good or sinful I am.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
No matter how biased or unbiased I am.
No matter how biased or unbiased I am.
God
God is my God, and I belong to God.
No matter how just or unjust I am,
No matter how just or unjust I am,
God is my God, and I belong to God.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
No matter how full or how empty I am,
No matter how full or how empty I am,
no matter how energized or weary I am,
no matter how energized or weary I am,
no matter how discouraged or encouraged I am,
no matter how discouraged or encouraged I am,
God is my God, and I belong to God.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
No matter how happy or angry I am,
No matter how happy or angry I am,
no matter how early or late I am,
no matter how early or late I am,
no matter how poor or wealthy I am,
no matter how poor or wealthy I am,
no matter how thirsty or quenched I am,
no matter how thirsty or quenched I am,
God is my God,
God is my God,
and I belong to God.
and I belong to God,
Wherever I am,
wherever I am,
in all the ways I am,
in all the ways I am.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
God is my God, and I belong to God.
This is God's promise, God's covenant, and it is so. Amen. Remember? So, since I don't have anything from you, I'm going to invite each of you to choose a stone. Choose a stone. No, these are from a different fountain, but I have two fountains in my office. But come on up. And I'm going to share with you just a little tiny bit of what I shared on Wednesday night. The rock is very cold in your hand when you first pick it up, isn't it? But the longer you hold your stone, the warmer the stone becomes. It takes on your heat. Little rock, where have you been? Little rock, tell me what you've seen. When the earth was hot and new, where were you, rock? Where were you? Little rock, where have you been? All of the stones and rocks in the earth are so much older than we are. And they could tell us their story of everything they've seen and everything they've heard. Wow. What a story that would be. Imagine, what might the stone tell us? Maybe the stone would tell us that when the earth started, it was very hot. And then as the earth cooled, the stones cooled too. And then maybe a dinosaur stepped on it. You think? Is that possible? Sure it is! And then maybe a person stepped on it. And then somebody like me comes along and picks it up. I'm a rock collector. I like rocks. Because I think if they could tell us their story,